Module 2 of an overview of American environmental policy fast forwards a bit and takes a look at the advancement of environmental policy since the end of World War II. Remember, during the Great Depression and then World War II, we couldn't focus quite as much as we would want to on environmental policy. There were a lot of programs related to the Great Depression and the New Deal that did help to preserve a lot of natural habitat around the country. But most of the pent-up kind of demand that we see coming out of the Great Depression and World War II leads to this expansive boom once we get out of World War II at the end of 1945. And there's two types of things that kind of happen at this point in time. One is we spend an enormous amount of resources on developing the United States. And the second thing is that we have an unbridled kind of belief in scientific progress in the United States at this point in time. Some of it to the detriment of our ability to be able to deal with the environment. So, for example, nuclear energy was something that comes out as a consequence of the atomic bomb. And we can use it for civilian uses, and we were convinced that this was a way that we could have really cheap power for very little expense. However, at the same time, we were not overly concerned at this point in time, right after World War II, and using this in a way that might be environmentally sustainable. We weren't concerned about kind of the environmental degradation that might come about as a result of something like a meltdown or something like that. Second thing is, as we move out of World War II, we have a growing belief in our ability to be able to yield better crops through the use of pesticides. And this certainly had an advantageous idea in that we were focusing in on creating food for a cheaper cost and being able to grow more crops and to feed the hungry. However, at the same time, we didn't really realize some of the environmental consequences associated with this. So we had all this consumption and all this building after World War II and didn't think a whole lot about the consequences. A great example of one of the things that we didn't overly think about what the consequences would be for the environment was the passage in 1956 of what was called the National Interstate and Defense Highways Act. And the purpose of this, ostensibly, the reason why the federal government got involved in building interstate highways to begin with was the concept that we needed to be able to move our military around the country. It also had to do with commerce. But in thinking about this, we basically developed our American interstate system in a way that led to development in suburban areas, which also led to deforestation, led to suburban sprawl. It also cut cities and bisected cities in half by building various different types of interstate highways. Witness Philadelphia, the Vine Street Expressway. Witness Philadelphia, Interstate 95. If you've ever been to Baltimore, kind of the cloverleaf that connects the main downtown with Interstate 95 completely cut off entire neighborhoods of the city of Baltimore, and on it goes. So one of the problems was that we thought this was a pretty good idea at the time, but it created a trajectory in which we focused in on development and also focused in on the car being our main source of transportation in the United States at the expense of things like mass transit. Right? So there are unintended consequences of some of these policies of development after World War II that we didn't quite pay as much of attention to as we might have otherwise, which then leads towards the advent of the environmental movement as we go forward. Now, I ask you to watch 3 different videos related to 3 different focusing events which lead to really big, massive change in the late 1960s and early 1970s that leads to an explosion of environmental policies and really the modern environmental state that we have today. So the first one was a book that was actually serialized in the New Yorker in early 1962 by Rachel Carson, who happens to be a Pennsylvanian. And Rachel Carson wrote this serialized thing that became a book later that year called Silent Spring. And the notion behind this was that we had this new pesticide called DDT. Again, the idea was to eradicate bugs and pests and live in a better world, more food, less pests, no mosquitoes. But what we found was that the consequence of that was that we were also killing off things that we wanted, such as birds. And one of the problems with DDT was that the shell of an egg was in essence not as hard as a consequence of DDT. And because of that factor, birds were not being born. And Rachel Carson envisioned a future in which we had a silent spring where there would be no birds. So this becomes this focusing event that leads to kind of change in relationship to the idea of pesticides in society and a focus on the consequences of using them. Focusing event number one. Focusing event number two comes in the late 60s. Everybody's always heard, this idea of this fire that happened out in Cleveland. The Cuyahoga River caught on fire a number of times through the 50s and 60s as a consequence of pollution from industry there. June 22nd, 1969, it really catches on fire, and people see this as a focusing event. Wow. Now, because we're focused more on the environment, we really need to do something about this. And that became a focusing event on things like clean water action. And then finally, Earth Day on April 22nd, 1970, the very first Earth Day, was really the first big mass movement. So we had seen a number of mass movements that occur throughout the 50s and 60s. We see civil rights, we see the anti-war demonstrations, we see women's rights, and the environmental movement really gets kicked off, and it grows directly out of all those other movements as well. And the one thing that really is the focusing event for change when it comes to this was this first Earth Day where an estimated 20 million people marched around the country. And it was driven, as you can see from some of the videos, primarily by college students. And the focus here was that we could no longer continue in this consumer capitalist society in which we use products with a disregard for their consequences on the environment, that we had to think about, intentionally think about how we were going to be able to live a sustainable life going forward. So what do all these three things come together and do? Well, for one thing, and it's difficult to understand at this point when environmental policy is probably one of the more contentious issues that we face, there was a semi-bipartisan kind of belief that we needed environmental policies in the United States. And really, we don't kind of consider Richard Nixon as being an environmental president, but he really presided over most of the major expansion of environmental policies in the United States during his almost 2 terms in office. So we see this really rapid change occurring, and primarily during his administration. He had a Democratic Congress the entire time. And just read this one quote here from his 1970 State of the Union address. He said, the 1970s as a decade absolutely must be the years when America pays its debt to the past by reclaiming the purity of its air, its waters. It's literally now or never. And this was a way in which kind of conservatives, the idea of conserving actually was part of kind of the conservative theory of Nixon at that point in time, joined together with liberals to focus on environmental policy. While they didn't always agree on how to do this, there was some form of consensus at this point in time. Now, what transpires? Well, there's 2 major things that I'd like to take a look at, and we'll look at it quickly. The first was the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969. And we've never really kind of had an overall overarching environmental policy in this country, but this is probably the closest thing to it. This combined with kind of the Earth Day marches led to the development of the Environmental Protection Agency in late 1970. But what the National Environmental Policy Act did was essentially say anytime the government was going to do something that might affect the environment, we had to step back and take an assessment of that project and how it would affect the environment. So for the first time we really became cognizant of the fact that there are projects such as roads, projects such as building schools and various other things that have a real tangible effect on the environment. And the federal government said that we have to study the impact on that. And it not only was a study of the impact, but allowed for public input as well. therefore kind of breaking what we would call the iron triangle. So it was no longer just business, government, and industries that were the ones making decisions. Now people had the ability to be able to say something about development in their areas. The one thing about environmental impact statements is that even though they may say that there's harm to the environment, it doesn't necessarily mean that a project can't go forward. But that assessment could be used for lawsuits later on by people who are concerned about the environment. So that's a really big thing that comes out. The second thing is a series of acts by Congress and the President that essentially deal with environmental protection and also pollution control. So here we see this slew of various things that happened between 1963 and 1980 dealing with the environment. So we had the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Safe Drinking Water Act, basically hazardous waste and solid waste, commercial chemicals, and then we had insecticides, and finally what we called the Superfund program, which was dealing with the problem of these toxic waste sites around the country. So all of these come at a really fast pace as we see it through the 1960s and 1970s as a consequence of these focusing events and a public movement on behalf of this. I'll let it to the rest of your book to see as the way that these things develop over time and the reaction to the public policies, but that's the development as we see it over the course of the middle part of the 20th century.